Hi, I'm Melissa McMahon with Care Paravel Academy. So you've decided to use Ambleside Online. Great choice. But now you have to decide how to place your children in what year you're going to use, or if you're going to combine some children, and how to make that decision. So I'm going to give you 5 tips today on how to make the decision, things to consider as you're placing your children in Ambleside Online. First one I want you to consider is age, and that's pretty straightforward. If you just have one child and they are 6 years old, then you start them in year 1. And if you do that, then you just continue on the next year, the next year, the next year, and the next year until you get up to year 12, and then they're finished and graduated and ready for whatever comes next. It's a little more complicated if maybe they're 8 or 9. Their age might mean year 8 would typically be year 3 if you started out as a 6-year-old in year 1, but maybe year 2 would be better. But the first thing you need to know is their age. A 14-year-old doesn't need to be doing year 2, so you can rule out some things there. The second thing you need to consider, and probably the most important, is which year is going to challenge your child without overwhelming him or her. To do this, don't look at the free reads list because those are typically a little bit easier reads. Look at some of the more the middle of the road reads of each year. So usually that will be the history reads. I would just send you there, or the literature reads. There are always some stretching books in each year. So for instance, Robinson Crusoe in year 4 is a stretching book. So if your 10-year-old cannot understand Robinson Crusoe, that's okay. They still might be good in year 4. That'll just be a stretching book for that year. So look at the history readings. Most of these are online, so you can pull them up for free before you even have to buy a book because they're in the public domain. Try those with your kids, see if it's going to be just super overwhelming, and then look at some lower years. Because, as you know, probably by now, Ambleside years do not necessarily correspond with grade levels. They can be completely different, but they'll usually be, within 2 or 3 years of what their grade level would be. Third, you need to consider not to choose a year based on the history that it covers. So for instance, let's say that you are coming from a different curriculum and your next history would be in the Middle Ages. So you might think you want to choose something that's going to be whatever the Middle Ages year is. Don't do that. Because Ambleside years are linear as far as history goes. It goes from year 1 to year 6, and then at the later part of year 6, it switches over to the ancients and does the next 6 years, next history cycle. So you don't want to be choosing specific to history. If they've already done Middle Ages, let's say, or early American history, but then they're coming into Ambleside and the year that you've determined to be the most challenging for them is doing American history again, just go with it. It's probably different books. It'll be a different experience for them. Be much better for them to be challenged but not overwhelmed by the books because these books are building in difficulty each year. And it does repeat again. So if you've got somebody in year 8, she'll be doing the same thing as little sister in year 3, history-wise, but just much more challenging books. You don't want to have to rewrite the curriculum. You really, really don't. The fourth thing I want you to consider, also key, is the sibling relationships. And we'll talk a little bit later about your different options if you have multiple children, but just keep that in mind. That does need to be a considering factor. Fifth, I want you to remember that the upper years have much flexibility. So don't make your decision in the early years based on, but I want to get through year 12, because by the time you get there, you've got a lot of flexibility. Years 9 through 12 are all salad bar approaches, so you're picking and choosing anyway, and you can be much more free to choose things and for them all to fit much more easily than you can in the early years. So I would strongly encourage you to have a full foundation, years 1 through 8 if you can, and then work on more flexibility in the upper years. Years 7 and up can count for high school credit for Ambleside, and if you look at those books, you'll see why. I mean, my children were literally using books that I used in college in years 7 and 8. So I have no qualms about putting that on their high school transcript because those are high school, if not college level books that they're using there. So don't be so concerned about that. You will need to amp up the science for high school, but you're going to have to do that anyway, but especially year 7 and 8. you need to keep that in mind. So that works out pretty well if you just have one child and it's pretty straightforward as far as age and all of that. If you have multiple children, it might look a little more daunting because you are talking about perhaps several years of different Ambleside years that you're juggling as mom. So I'm going to give you some options here. The first option is for everybody to have her own year. And that's what our family has chosen to do because that was kind of the only option when we started 12 years ago. And it's worked fine. The first few years before they get independent, I did feel like I was just juggling all the time, spinning plates, just going from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. But they grew in independence, and it wasn't like that for very long. Really, just a year or two. It was kind of dicey, but it was good, and we got through it, and it was fine. Some advantages for that is that you know that everybody is on the level she needs to be, and that is key. Again, you want them to be challenged but not overwhelmed. A con for that is that it is more on mom, so just be aware of that. If your children are older starting out, then it won't be so much because they'll be more independent from the get-go. And also, your little ones that you're starting off with, they will get more independent. So if you're looking at this and you've got a year 1 and a year 2 and a year 3, and it looks completely daunting to be able to add in a 4th child after that, your year 3 is going to be bigger and older and more independent. And so will your year 2 and your year 1. So you're not just adding 2, you're moving on from that. So don't let that be too overwhelming. But it is a consideration that it is more on mom. The second option that you have is AmblesideOnline for groups. Now, this was put together a few years ago, mostly with cottage schools in mind, but large families have found it useful. A pro for this is that you do have your children in the same year, but it's only for 3 years at a time because it's divided by forms. So if you have some children that are in the ages and in the abilities of years 1 through 3, you can very easily put them in Form 1. A disadvantage for this is that their history will not be linear. If you start in Form 1, year 1, then the next year you might be adding a student in for part 2 for that. So they'd be jumping into history. And so their history might be 2-3-1 instead, or 3-1-2, but it's not going to be as linear, which would bother me, I think. Some kids can do fine with it, and if you're working with a timeline, it won't matter so much, but that is a con. The other con is that it is limited. If you've got a 5th grader and a 1st grader, it's not going to work because their abilities and ages are just too vast for that, generally, unless your 5th grader would do well in year 3, and then perhaps you could. But generally, the students, it won't work for very long. But you can blend it with that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So you can start with AO for groups for the early years, and as they get more independent, spin them off into their own year when it gets to year 4. And that's probably what I would have done if we'd had AO for groups starting off, since my first 4 kids were born in 4.5 years. They were very close in age, and that would have given some relief to me in the early years. Let us be together and then spin off into individual years. So that's an option for you too. Another option for you is to combine 2 children into 1 year. I personally do not see that happening, do not see that working well in our family, mainly because of sibling relationships. The students that I would have put together who are close in age, it would have been really disheartening to the older student and maybe either more difficult or more inducing to pride in the younger student. So you know your kids best, and there might be some families where this works great, but for us, I knew that it wouldn't really. A pro on that would be it's easier on mom, and they're both doing the same thing. A con would be, again, sibling relationship, which is a big con to me. And secondly, just sharing things. Are you going to have one book that they're going to switch off on? I don't know how well that works. So, and again, if they're independent, it doesn't really help you that much, though it might, and your kids might love working together. And certainly if you have twins or something, that would be what you would be doing anyway. A 4th approach is blended, as I had mentioned earlier before, that you can start off in groups and then go off into individual years. And I think that could be a great way to do it. A pro to that is that you're transitioning to independence. A con could also be sibling relationships. If all your younger siblings are still in the form group 1 together and you're independent, that might be good, or you might kind of feel left out from the family. So another option that we have done as a family, we've all had individual years, but it's been blended in that we do have morning time together. And every family with multiple children can do this. And you'll find out lots more on the internet. Cindy Rollins is a great resource for that. And I might do another video on morning time. But for us, it is look different every year, but it's usually our time that we do Bible and memory work and poetry. I choose my middle child's poet. We'll do Shakespeare together, Plutarch, Pilgrim's Progress. You can do that. Now, in the individual years, you can also blend some things together. So when I had children in year 1 and year 2, I would combine some of those readings, Parables from Nature, the Berry book, Trial and Triumph. You get off the history rotation a little bit, but it's okay. So you can look to where you can combine some of those individual books, but still give your child their own history stream and their own year. So I've given you lots of different options. I hope that this kind of clarifies things for you and at least helps you to make these decisions for your children. I do encourage you to, again, look at your individual child and where they're going to be challenged, but not overwhelmed, and at the sibling relationships, especially, to keep those intact. But Ambleside, all 12 years are wonderful years, so whatever you choose will be good, and you will get to the other things eventually. So don't be discouraged, but I hope that it is all a lovely time for you and your family. Thank you, and blessings to you and your family.